Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about Aspecio. It's an Aspect framework that I wrote some time ago for OSGi. It was a bit missing, so indeed I'm Simon, or Simon, and I work as a software architect for a French company that does network analytics. And we try to have this state-of-the-art backend system, so microservices, Docker, dynamic with non-blocking, asynchronous, whatever you want. And so we are OSGi-powered. We try to do things by the letter. And even though, as the system grew, we came to find that there were some verbosity, some boilerplate repeated here and elsewhere. Mostly, I'll show you where in the implementations. So actually, aspects are a solution for that, for the problem we had. And there was no good solution in OSGi, so I made one. So first, Aspecio. It's open source. It's licensed under the Apache license. You can get it on GitHub. There is some documentation as well. So if there are any Eclipse developers in the room, I'm going to talk about OSGi, but it applies to Equinox. And as you will see, you need to have control over the framework because of the way it works. So if you have an RCP application, it will work. If it's on Eclipse IDE, more tricky. Should work, but more tricky. OK. So first, I'm going to go into more details in why we're trying to solve here. This is common stuff for people who know about aspects, who have played with aspects. Then I will show a bit more in detail what's different with Aspecio and how you can use it. OK. So first, you've all heard about the drive principle. Do not repeat yourself. It's more like a rule of thumb saying if you have that piece of code repeated in several places in your code, you should think about it. Is it OK? Is it normal? Maybe it's good to have. Sometimes it's good to repeat rather than just try to share it. But it makes you think. And obviously, when you share code, that's what OSGi solves. You're going to fix your problem once. If you have that piece of code, you put it in a service. If there is a bug, you fix it once. OK, basic stuff. And also, you improve readability, because if you have only the business code, you can focus, and it makes it more maintainable. OK. So OSGi, as I said, it solves API and service modularity. But then you have implementation. I'll show you what I mean by implementations. You don't have that the same solution. So we call these, in aspects, cross-cutting concerns like authentication, logging, and a lot of stuff that is repeated, like boilerplate you have in the same components. You try to solve it. So oftentimes you have this. You have so this is declarative service. That's what we use, but you can work with any component framework. You have a component providing a service, here, book manager. And basically, you have one method in that interface that you care about. It's the getBook method. And still, you have to have some access control on it. So here, I have a synchronous call to a method that makes sure you are allowed to actually get the book. And I'm using that service. So the reference is injecting a service, the access control service, and making sure it is here. And this gets old because it gets repeated, this boilerplate, in a bunch of components. And you want to get rid of it. And you would like to do that. Just say, OK. And if you have used Spring AOP or Juice, actually, you get this. But we use, actually, in OSGi, because everything is made from scratch. There is no such framework that works out of the box that deals with dynamics that works. So when you can extract the code and focus on the business code, it becomes clearer. But at the same time, you can maybe add more let's say, what would have been boilerplate that is not. Maybe I want to measure the performance of that code now. and I just have to have add an annotation. Okay. So that's what we would like, where we would like to go, but how to make it happen. So that's what Aspecio tries to provide. So first, if you have, for those of you who know about aspects, there are several kinds of aspect frameworks in Java. There is AspectJ, which is very famous, but there is also Spring, AOP, and Juice. So like Spring and Juice, Aspecio does proxy-based AOP. It means we don't change the code. Traditionally, aspects are, there is your code in bytecode, there is the aspect definition, you weave it together, and you have a brand new bytecode. And then when you put a breakpoint in that piece of code, you don't know what's going on. So these kind of aspects are very powerful. That's a good thing about them. But they're also very powerful, which is also the bad thing about them. And proxy-based AOP is different. Your code is not changed, and instead, you get a proxy that is injected rather than your service, and that will let you intercept code. Okay, so then Aspecio is built with OSGi in mind. So it uses only OSGi APIs. So if you have an OSGi framework, it works. It's component framework agnostic. So if you use declarative services, if you use, I don't know, dependency manager, Hypojo, Blueprint, whatever, it will work, even if you declare your services programmatically. And also, when you have proxy, you have overhead. So it's designed to have very low overhead. So that's the big picture. So for those who are not familiar with this kind of diagrams, the purple squares are like objects, implementations, and they provide service if you have the little lollipop, and if you have the, I don't know, the moon crescent, it means you consume that service, you're using it. So usually, if you look at the top components, I will call them components, a service says, I provide that service. A component says, I provide that service. Another says, I want that service, and they get wired. And what Aspecio does is when a specific service is, OK, I provide a service, but I want to be woven, I want to be decorated. You say, Aspecio comes in and says the framework, no, no, it's not you who provides it, it's me. Instead, it injects, it creates this proxy, and it will register itself as a service instead of the original service. So actually, the other one is still registered, but Aspecio hides it from the consumers. OK, so how is this possible? How can you say no? How can Aspecio do that? Actually, there were some framework hooks that were introduced in OSGi a few years ago that have been updated recently. So you might think, because it's aspects, that we are using those weaving hooks. But no, those hooks were designed for the traditional AspectJ weaving bytecode change frameworks. So these allow to change the bytecode the first time a bundle loads a class. Cool, but not what we do. What we do is service hooks. We intercept everything the other bundles see. So when a bundle comes in and says, I want the book manager, we know that this one is special because it has this little sheriff star who says, hey, Aspecio helps me. And so we filter that service from him and from all other consumers. OK. So how to use Aspecio? So first, as I said, it doesn't really need any component framework or anything. It works with plain OSGi. So to tell you to have that little sheriff star and to say, OK, I want to be woven, I want to be decorated, you just use service properties. So there are two of them, because I wanted to have the OSGi service kind of dynamics. So it's like if you're used to component frameworks in OSGi, like declarative services, you have optional or required references, dynamic or static, and greedy or not. Well, this control that aspect. Do I really need that aspect to be consumed? Or is it just optional? Like, when I want metrics, do I want to block completely my consumption if a metric service is not available, if a metric aspect is not available? So you can control that here. And as we will see, aspects are themselves services. So they can come, they can be replies, they can, so. Then, okay, so we have to name aspects. So the idea, the question here was, should aspects be an implementation, or should aspects be a concept? Should aspects be a concrete class, or should it be, let's say, an interface? Or, so I chose to represent aspects as concepts, so you can have several implementations. So when you're going to mock an aspect in a test, if you want to do that, you could say, okay, this aspect has a mock, is implemented by a mock or not. Okay. So let's see. Let's go back to our previous book manager component and see how it would work. Well, we still have the two methods, the two annotations that we had, ensure, authorized, and measured. But now we use those properties to get that little star to say, to tell Aspecio you want to be decorated. And those properties are the one I just showed. So now I say I want to be decorated with the authentication aspect and the metric aspect. So if you have attended Carsten talk just now, you will see that this syntax is very cumbersome. And because I'm very impatient, I didn't wait for the spec upgrade, I have a little BND plugin that does just that. So I can say I want to weave that component. And the required aspects are the auth aspect and the metric aspect. OK? And because, as I said, maybe I don't care so much about metrics. I mean, authentication is very necessary. I mean, I don't want to be to give a secret book to someone who isn't allowed. So I want it to be required. And that means that if the aspect is not satisfied, then my component is not available. Then all the components that will require that service will not will not be able to get it because it will not be there. And the metric aspect, I want to make it optional. OK. So it kind of solves the first problem we had of reducing that boilerplate. And now, OK, I have applied an aspect, so it's very short, very easy. You have your component, you have like a few annotations to put on, and it's done. But now how do you define aspects? On the other side, how can I create that auth aspect or that metric aspect? So first, how do you name them? So it could be a string. I chose to use Java class names or interfaces. So we can use package wiring and avoid conflicts. And to publish an aspect, you just register an OSGi service that implements one interface called Interceptor. And again, we use a property to make sure to tell you the framework which aspect is implemented. So first, I define the marker interface for that aspect. And then I publish my service, and I tell it provides that aspect. OK, we can ignore the extra property for now. OK. So now what do we have here? So first, what's really cool about having aspects as OSGi services that you can use component frameworks, and then you can depend on other services. So I don't want my metric logic to be in that aspect. Obviously, I want it in a separate service. So I'm going to inject it here with a static reference. And for those of you who have used CodaHail's metrics registry library, this is just a wrapper around it. So what I do here is when a method is annotated with measured, I can get the method name, create a timer about that method name. Then, OK, it's going to be called. And when it's done, yeah, I will close the timer. And this way, you can have a count, method invocation count, and so on. So this is the simplest aspect I can write. But you can write a lot more. Okay, so we'll see a bit more about interceptors now. So, as I said, if you provide a service, it's called, you provide a service interceptor, all right. And by default, because you proxy, every time a service says, I want to be woven, you have that proxy. So you get to be notified about any call. And if you want to narrow it down, you can just match some annotations, just like I showed, or not. And again, because it's OSGi and you can have several concurrent implementations, maybe several interceptors are providing the same aspect, then they can compete to provide that aspect. If one goes down, another can replace it. So that's just like a dynamic, greedy reference. And then we have that on-call method, which is the heart of aspect design in Aspecio. It returns an advice when it's called for all the interceptors that are applied on a given Aspecio proxy. So they can do plenty of things. They can get the actual arguments that the method is called with, and you can change them before the code. And these arguments are pretty cool because they're also, the object that is created is immutable and has hash code and equal, so you can have a cache aspect if you want, if your arguments are immutable by themselves. You can do plenty of things that you do with all aspect frameworks, but one more thing that you can't do, I think, with many of them is to have all primitive type support, because, okay, I don't know if you have services that get called a lot. Sometimes it happens, and because we are doing sensitive, performance-sensitive code, we don't want to pay for boxing. So let's go back again. You remember that proxy? So now I'm going to talk about how this proxy works. So basically, it's just a delegation pattern. If that okay, so we start from the component, the implementation book manager imp, and it provides one or several services. For all of these services, there will be one proxy, and it will delegate all the code to the public methods on those interfaces. Okay, so these proxies, it gets a bit technical. They're generated with ASM, the bytecode manipulation library. And they're designed to be fast, and so that you pay only what you use. So, for instance, if you don't need to get the arguments of an invocation because it creates an object, that class itself won't be even created or loaded. And then this is the fun feature for me. Because when you have aspect frameworks, usually they use JDK proxies or CGI lib proxies, and these, they erase types, they don't show the annotation that are, they don't reflect the annotation, they don't proxy, let's say, the annotations. And now we have a lot and more frameworks that rely on annotation introspection, for instance, Jersey, and you want to keep that information. And those proxies, because they know the class they're decorating, they get those annotations as well. So all frameworks should work out of the box, because it's very difficult to make a difference between the original class and the proxy by its signature. OK, so as I said, if you have several interfaces, it will work. Obviously, like many aspect frameworks, I don't even try to proxy concrete classes. Works only with services providing interfaces. I mean, it's OSGi, so service properties work as expected. They are forwarded as well. If they change on the side, like if the service registration works, or if the service decorator from the previous talk changed something, it will be reflected on the web service. And if you have different scopes, so now in OSGi, you can have a service that is a singleton. There is one in the framework, a bundle. Each bundle gets its own version, maybe not. And lastly, a prototype. You can get a new instance of a service every time you want to consume one. Well, Aspecio will handle all that. Maybe it's not very used, but for those who use it, it's cool. OK, so if you want to start with Aspecio, first, I think I try to make it easy, so it's just one bundle. It doesn't have any external dependency, except OSGi itself. If you use LSLF4j, it will log with it, otherwise gel. But because it uses framework hooks, it has to be installed very early in the process. That's why I said at the start of the talk that if you want to use it with Eclipse IDE, because you don't control the startup and the start level, maybe, you cannot make sure it is installed before any bundle making use of it. So maybe one day it will be improved in R8, the new spec, I don't know. So it also provides shell commands. So you can see what aspects are available, see what Aspecio sees, and what are the services woven with which aspect and so on. OK. So I want to summarize a bit. So Aspecio is a bit of a component framework because it has to keep track of all of these services, and it registers services on behalf of other bundles. For instance, when we hide a service that's coming somewhere, the new service that's registered instead is registered by the same bundle. So yeah, it's transparent. And if you have like security based on which bundle is providing what, it should still work. For me, it was a fun project because it does a lot of bytecode manipulation. And then I chose to go with a Java API to define advices rather than go with AspectJ, which is another language altogether, because I wanted to limit the scope. I don't need the whole scope of AspectJ. And I mean, everyone has Java. Everyone has a tool chain when you're programming. So it's easier to get started. It's faster to get started, I think. So we've been using it for like 6 months. It's a big project. The team started putting aspects everywhere. You must not abuse it. It's not. It's something for implementation. It's not the design primitive, which remains the service. But when you have an easy access to measurements, to logging exceptions, because instead of all the boilerplate code, it gets it started sprouting everywhere, and with cool benefits. As I said, it's not for everything, but some aspects are very useful. And the thing is, if you don't run with Aspecio, but you have exactly the same code, for instance, when you're doing some integration testing, maybe you don't care about authentication in that particular setup or that test. Then you just remove Aspecio, you don't start it, and it will work transparently. So it's practical. You don't need to mock a bunch of stuff that you feel unnecessary for tests. And then, of course, it could be improved. I have some ideas for 2 versions. So now, Aspecio is, but like all Aspect frameworks, I think, really synchronous in nature. Maybe if we look back at the authentication process, the ensure authorized promise, maybe I'm asking a remote service and I don't want a synchronous call. Maybe I want a promise instead. And when that promise is satisfied, then I execute the next step. So I can proceed then. And this, you can't make it. You have to make the two calls in parallel. So you can make it, but you cannot ensure now without blocking that the code that you proceed to will not be made if the call is not done. Okay, so I'm not sure if I'm clear, but and then one of the caveats with proxy-based AOP is that when you are in your components, like in the book manager implementation, and you call another method from inside using this or just calling it, and it has annotations that you expect aspects to work with, it won't work because you're not calling the proxy, you're calling yourself. And that's the same with Spring, that's the same with Juice, that's the same with everything. So I think it's a good thing because it forces you to think more about boundaries of what's your implementation, what's in between. And I think the service interface, the service layer, the service boundary is the right boundary to have your aspects at, and this kind of code. So when you make a call from another component, then the aspects run. If you do it from inside or from local references, you can't. And when you're inside, you cannot get a reference to the proxy. Some frameworks provide a hack to get a singleton which knows the current aspect and so on. But it creates a cycle, it's ugly, so the better idea is to say, okay, live with it, have your implementations do one thing, do it well, and let the aspects deal with the calls from outside. Okay, so this is it. You can download the Aspecio and try it, or find me to help you get started. It's really, really easy. I think in 10 minutes, if you have an OSGi project, you can get metrics on your code. That's a very low-hanging fruit, and it's a small benefit, but then you know which methods are taking time. Even if you have methods that return, for instance, a promise that are asynchronous, you can measure both the sync time and the total completion time. And this is, for us, it was very nice to see where there are bottlenecks and so on. Okay, so now we'll have some questions.
So, yeah. So when you started all this, did you do sort of a check on the different, like, did you check out AspectJ and?
Yeah, actually I used AspectJ before.
What did you also check bytecode?
Which one?
Bytecode.
Well,
it's a newcomer.
It's a new?
Yeah, it's a new thing.
Well, no, I didn't. Actually, Aspecio was a few days of code. I had that each. I scratched it. But the thing is, from my experience, when you want to have something that works properly with OSGi dynamics, you just have, either it's been made with some people from the community, and I know then it's going to work, or you have to make it yourself. So that's what I did. Yes?
So I've just got a quick question. You're injecting code into the stack effectively by creating this proxy. What work and testing have you done to make sure that it still works if you turn on OSGi security?
Well, none. Easy question, thank you. No, but I mean, there's no reason it shouldn't work.
What happens if I'm using code analysis tools? Probably depends whether they analyze bytecode or not. Am I right? Or, do you have experience using code analysis tools?
They won't see the aspects. The aspects are generated dynamically. So if you use static analysis, it just doesn't exist at compile time. And if you have some tools that look at them during runtime, then you will they will see just like if you had written a delegate, you know, kind of pattern. I mean, it's basic Java. I mean, it's just that you can't generate that piece of Java code every time. That's the idea, but there's nothing fancy.
But the aspect may change the flow.
No. Those aspects, they don't change your code.
The control flow is changed.
Yeah, there is one, like he said in the stack, there is one call in between, just like if you had written by yourself a delegate components that call the other, but it's just one call. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I just meant that the code analysis doesn't analyze the aspect as well, so
True.
you cannot see what the aspects which do additionally.
Yeah, but
maybe a problem.
I don't know. I think it's the same with all aspect frameworks, except maybe AspectJ if it has that kind of extra tooling, because it has some tooling around. But on the scope of what you can do with Aspecio or with proxy-based AOP in general is much more limited. So, well, yeah, I think that a tool like this could be written, but I'm not sure that it's worth it. I'm not sure it's worth it. Okay, so thank you.